Pakistan's economy. I'm joined by Saeed Khan. He's a lecturer in the Near East and Asian Studies at Wayne State University. Good to have you on the show. You know, Pakistan's faced a number of headwinds over the past number of years, and I guess it's no secret that it's been a challenge to overcome not only those headwinds, but also dealing with new ones. What's the situation there on the ground, specifically with the economy there right now?
The situation, Phil, is quite dire. In fact, I was just in Pakistan about 2 weeks ago watching the rupee in practically a free fall. It's lost about 35% of its value over the last year. But what we see, though, is an almost totalistic shutdown of the country. As you recall, about 3 or 4 weeks ago, there was a power outage that affected the entire country. Industrial sectors, including steel, textiles, and pharmaceuticals, are practically shut down. There really aren't many supplies that are available. The inflation rate, as we just heard, is 28%. The government has raised the interest rate to 17%. There is a shortage when it comes to food and basic supplies, especially for, as was mentioned, the common person. And what we find here is soaring prices when it comes to cooking oil and basic food commodities. Overall, Pakistan is in a moment of its history that's probably unprecedented when it comes to the kind of economic strain in which it finds itself.
I mean, doesn't Pakistan get a tremendous amount of aid from neighboring countries, and they've been dealing with a lot of these shortages for some time now? This didn't happen overnight. This is a process that took place after months and quarters of sort of insufficient assistance, if you will. Is there something the government can or should or maybe didn't do that accelerated them getting to this place economically?
Well, part of it, of course, is the kind of political transformation that has happened recently. Imran Khan, who seemed to be the person holding the public trust, was removed through a vote of no confidence with this new coalition involving the Sharif and the Bhutto families. That has, of course, created many conspiracy theories as to whether this was a move from external forces to destabilize Pakistan or to try to make it radioactive to foreign investment, including that when it comes to China. Some of the countries that you mentioned, including Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, ones who had in the past been fairly generous with providing both aid as well as subsidized energy products, now seem to be a little bit more gun shy. Saudi Arabia, for example, has made any future aid conditional on demanding internal market reforms within Pakistan. So what we're faced here is really a perfect storm, if you will. The catastrophic flooding that has happened, the remnants of which are still being felt and witnessed in the country. Estimates place $16 billion just to provide their kind of reconstruction and repair for that alone. Along with that, the political situation, a kind of systemic corruption, which allegations, of course, are rife with that, along with, of course, the inflation and overall sense of instability has then created all of this current chaos.
So with that background, I mean, whether it was China or the IMF or a combination of various countries putting together billions and billions of funds, there's still the issue of proper distribution and ultimately a stable government to help distribute those funds, or I guess use the funds in the proper manner that ultimately helps the country. And you can see why people would be hesitant to give at this point. I mean, what assurances would the IMF or any other country for that matter have that these funds would go to those who need the most help?
Right now, it seems as though there aren't any, Phil, and that then becomes the vicious circle that aid will not come unless those assurances are made, and if those assurances are not backed with the kind of confidence for the creditors, then I'm afraid the situation for Pakistan doesn't really bode well.
Do you think there's a possibility that ultimately, because of the instability in the government, that leads to a degradation in the economic sector, which leads to the potential of potentially defaulting altogether on all of its debt at some point?
Well, there is that possibility given the fact that right now the foreign exchange reserves have dropped below $3 billion, which means that Pakistan has less than 3 weeks worth of reserves in order to pay its imports. And you see the kind of drastic measures that it's taking. The government has announced that they are going to now stop imports of liquefied natural gas. And so when we find then that there's going to be an even further deficit and deprivation of energy, what is that going to mean for both industry as well as common people? At the same time, it seems as though there is some guarded optimism that the IMF is willing to go ahead and still negotiate. It has not abandoned Pakistan. I think no country and no agency wants to see a similar fate happening in Pakistan that happened in Sri Lanka last year. After all, Pakistan's geopolitical, geostrategic importance and the fact that it is also a nuclear power means that the dynamics that are involved for various international aid have to be seen differently than they were for Sri Lanka.
Right, and so if the IMF comes in there, or any other country for that matter, I mean, you have a crisis that now has led to an economic crisis or even a political crisis that I just question whether money alone is going to solve it without some real restructuring in the government. How much money is needed, and what are the, I guess, last points of negotiations that need to be agreed upon to get the help they need?
Well, as I said before, you're looking at 16 billion just for the reconstruction due to the flooding that happened last year. Estimates are placing it somewhere along the lines of 270 to 300 billion dollars that are really going to be needed in order to get Pakistan out of its rather dire straits. Now, clearly, that is not an amount that the IMF or anybody is willing to give at this point. They're negotiating for a very short-term measure here of about $7 billion. Now, that doesn't mean that the IMF will not come back, or it doesn't mean that other countries will not, for example, restructure their debt. China, for example, holds about 30% of Pakistan's debt. They're going to want some assurances, particularly given the fact that China has invested $60 billion in the China-Pakistan economic corridor. There's a lot of moving parts that are at work here, Phil, and I think it's important to then recognize that all of these various entities that are stakeholders in the process, first and foremost, the government of Pakistan is going to have to yield. The big question is whether or not there's enough time, both for the economic recovery that's
Right.
needed and also to prevent a kind of further political destabilization, because that's something that certainly is going to be very dangerous for the country.
It is a crisis right now, and it appears that it's going to be another crisis in the making, and I'm sure the debtors would like to have their money back, but also a plan, if you will. I can go on for this. Thank you for your time, Saeed Khan,
Thank
lecturer
you.
there. Really appreciate the insights on this important story.